Hey everyone, welcome back. Thanks for tuning in again. Tonight, we're jumping into some unsettling, true horror stories that'll make you think twice about everyday encounters. So get comfortable, or maybe not too comfortable, and let's get started.
A couple of years ago, my girlfriend and I decided to go camping in a remote part of the national forest. We were both pretty experienced campers, and we loved the idea of getting far away from the crowds and just enjoying nature and peace. The drive was long, and the last part of it was down a bumpy, unpaved road, but eventually, we found a great spot by a small creek. It was perfect. No cell service, no other people around, just the two of us. We spent most of the first day setting up camp, hiking a bit and just relaxing. As the sun started to set, we made a fire and cooked some dinner. The sounds of the forest were calming, but there was this underlying tension in the air that I couldn't quite shake. I figured it was just the isolation getting to me. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. We got into our tent and settled down. That's when I first noticed the feeling that something was off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I felt like we weren't alone. I brushed it off as paranoia and closed my eyes. About an hour later, I woke up to a sound. It was faint, like the soft crunch of footsteps in the distance. I stayed still, listening. The sound was coming closer, slow and deliberate. My heart started to race, but I didn't want to wake my girlfriend and freak her out. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, right outside our tent. My breath caught in my throat. I could hear the sound of someone, breathing heavily, just inches away from where we were lying. I held my breath, hoping it was just an animal, but the way it lingered made me feel otherwise. I finally worked up the courage to grab the flashlight next to me, but before I could turn it on, the breathing stopped, and the footsteps retreated into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun came up, we packed up as fast as we could and got out of there. I never saw who or what was out there that night, but the feeling that we were being watched stayed with me long after we left. I don't know if it was someone playing a prank or something more sinister, but I haven't been back to that part of the woods since. I was solo camping for the first time when it happened. I had heard about how peaceful and rewarding solo trips could be, so I decided to give it a try. I picked a spot by a river in a quiet national park, far enough from the main trail to feel completely isolated. The first day went smoothly. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and spent the afternoon fishing. By dusk, I had a small fire going and was cooking the fish I'd caught. It was one of those serene moments where everything just felt perfect. The sound of the river flowing, the crackling of the fire. It was exactly what I needed to clear my head. As it got darker, though, I started feeling uneasy. It was subtle at first, like I was being watched. I figured it was just nerves since I wasn't used to being out here alone, but the feeling got stronger as the night wore on. Eventually, I convinced myself to go to bed and chalked it up to an overactive imagination. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of splashing. It was coming from the river, just a few yards away from my tent. I figured it was an animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it sounded too deliberate, like someone wading through the water. Curiosity got the better of me, so I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. My blood went cold. There was a man standing in the river, staring straight at my tent. He wasn't fishing, swimming, or doing anything else that made sense. He was just standing there, waist deep in the water, watching me. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I was terrified that if he saw me, something bad would happen. I don't know how long I stayed there, frozen. But eventually he turned and walked downstream, disappearing into the darkness. I packed up at first light and left without a second thought. I never reported it to the park rangers because I couldn't really explain what had happened. I don't know if that man was just passing through or if he had been watching me for longer than I realized. But I've never gone solo camping again. The image of him standing in that river haunts me to this day.
My buddies and I had planned a camping trip for months. We were supposed to meet at this remote spot deep in the mountains, a place one of our friends had been to a few times. I got off work late, so I arrived after dark. The drive up the mountain was rough, and I didn't have cell service to let them know I was running behind. When I finally pulled up, I saw a campsite with a fire already going, but there was no one around. Figuring my friends were off gathering firewood or something, I parked and set up my tent nearby. I waited for a bit, then decided to check out the surrounding area, calling out their names, but got no response. By the time I got back to the campsite, it was around midnight. Still no sign of my friends. I thought maybe they'd gone on a night hike or something. I wasn't too worried, just a little annoyed they hadn't waited for me. I sat by the fire for a while, then decided to call it a night and went to sleep. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps. They were heavy and deliberate, not like the light rustling of animals. I froze, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. Then I heard what sounded like someone rummaging through my gear. I worked up the courage to unzip my tent, but when I peeked out, there was no one there. My gear was scattered, but I couldn't see anyone in the immediate area. I quickly zipped the tent back up and grabbed a flashlight, shining it out into the woods. I caught a glimpse of a figure moving between the trees. It looked like a man, but it was too dark to make out any details. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sun came up, I packed up my stuff and hiked out of there. When I got back to the main trailhead, I finally got a signal and called my friends. Turns out, I had camped at the wrong site. They were about 2 miles away the whole time. I have no idea who was at that campsite with me, but I'm glad I didn't stick around to find out. A few summers ago, my girlfriend and I went camping at a popular state park. It was a busy weekend, so all the main sites were taken, but we managed to find a spot in a more secluded area. It was perfect, quiet, surrounded by trees and far from the crowds. The first night was uneventful. We cooked dinner, sat by the fire, and went to bed early. The second night, though, things got strange. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of branches snapping. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I figured it was just wildlife, so I tried to go back to sleep. A little while later, my girlfriend nudged me awake. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. At first I didn't hear anything, but then I caught it. A faint murmuring, like voices, coming from somewhere in the woods. It didn't sound like anyone was nearby, but the voices were unmistakable. I got out of the tent and stood by the fire pit listening. The voices stopped, and I thought maybe we were just imagining things. But as soon as I went back to bed, they started again, this time closer. I unzipped the tent and shone my flashlight into the trees, but I couldn't see anything. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" But got no response. The murmuring stopped again, but I had the overwhelming feeling that we weren't alone. We packed up at first light and left. I still don't know if there were other campers nearby who were messing with us, or if we were just hearing things, but the memory of those voices in the dark has stuck with me ever since. It's one of the creepiest experiences I've ever had in the woods. Last summer, my buddy Jake and I decided to go camping in the Rockies. We were both seasoned campers, and we wanted to tackle a new trail we'd heard about deep in the backcountry. The thing about this trail is that it's not marked on any of the official park maps. Jake heard about it from a friend who swore it was the best camping spot. You could find completely isolated, breathtaking views, and zero chance of running into other people. We packed our gear, drove out early, and spent hours hiking to find this unmarked trail. When we finally did, it was late afternoon, but the view was worth it. Mountains towering in the distance, a wide valley below, and not a soul in sight. We set up camp right as the sun was starting to set, cooked dinner, and settled in for the night. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside our tent. It wasn't the typical rustling you'd hear from an animal like deer or squirrels. It was heavier, more deliberate, like footsteps crunching through the underbrush. I nudged Jake awake and he told me to chill, that it was probably just a bear passing through. The footsteps continued, circling our tent. My heart was racing and I could hear Jake's breathing change. He was wide awake now too. Without making a sound, we both grabbed our knives, small ones we always kept next to us when camping. The footsteps stopped, but we could hear something brushing against the tent. It was subtle, like someone dragging their fingers along the fabric. I whispered, "Jake, what the hell is that?" He didn't answer. Suddenly, The tent door was yanked open, and for a split second, we saw a man's silhouette, scruffy, dirty clothes, and wild hair. He bolted before we could react, disappearing into the woods. We jumped out, adrenaline pumping, but all we could hear was the sound of him crashing through the trees. We didn't sleep at all after that. At first light, we packed up and hiked back as fast as we could. We never reported it to anyone because we figured no one would believe us. To this day, I wonder if that guy had been watching us the whole time, waiting for the right moment to do what, I don't know, but I'm not keen on finding out. I went camping with a group of friends in a national park none of us had been to before. We chose a weekend when the weather was perfect and made plans to hike to a remote campsite. When we got to the park, it was more crowded than we expected, and all the official campsites were booked. One of the park rangers told us there was an unofficial camping spot about a mile off the main trail that a lot of people used when the park was full. We found the trail easily enough, and sure enough, after hiking for about an hour, we came across a clearing with a fire pit already set up. It looked well used but deserted. We set up our tents, started a fire, and hung out for the rest of the evening. Everything was fine until about midnight when we started hearing strange noises in the woods. At first, it was just faint snapping sounds like twigs breaking underfoot, but then it got louder, like someone or something was pacing around our campsite just outside the light of the fire. We shined our flashlights into the trees, but there was nothing there. No animals, no people, just the sound of something moving just out of sight. We tried to brush it off, convincing ourselves it was just deer or something. But then, as we were sitting around the fire, one of our friends screamed. We all jumped up, shining our lights in her direction, but she was staring at the ground. Right where she had been sitting was a crude carving in the dirt, a symbol none of us recognized. We hadn't seen anyone near our campsite all day, and no one in the group admitted to doing it. We put the fire out and got into our tents, all of us feeling uneasy. About an hour later, I woke up to a strange smell, like something burning. I unzipped my tent, and that's when I saw it. Our fire had been relit, and around it were more of those strange carvings in the dirt. We packed up immediately and hiked out in the dark. To this day, none of us know what those symbols meant or who or what made them, but I'm not eager to go back and find out. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip with my girlfriend, Emily. We'd picked a spot in the mountains we'd visited once before, a quiet, off-the-grid area where few people ventured. We arrived early, set up camp, and planned to do some hiking the next day. On our first morning, we went for a short hike to explore a nearby waterfall. As we were walking, we came across an older man sitting on a fallen log by the trail. He looked like he'd been out there for days. Dirty clothes, unkempt hair, and a tired, distant look in his eyes. He didn't say anything as we passed, but the way he watched us sent chills down my spine. We continued hiking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Emily seemed uneasy too, but we tried to brush it off. That night, back at camp, we both woke up to the sound of someone, or something, moving through the trees. It was faint at first, but then we heard the unmistakable sound of twigs snapping, getting closer. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the woods. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure, a man standing just beyond the tree line, but he disappeared before I could get a good look. The next morning, we packed up and decided to cut our trip short. On our way out, we passed a park ranger and mentioned the man we'd seen on the trail. The ranger's face went pale. He told us that a man matching that description had been reported missing weeks ago. We left the park as fast as we could, and I haven't been able to shake the feeling that the man we saw wasn't just lost. He was waiting. Last summer, a couple of friends and I went camping at a spot just outside of our small town. It's a place we'd been to dozens of times before, tucked away near the river, with a perfect little clearing for setting up tents. Nothing special, but it was secluded, and that's what we liked about it. We arrived late in the afternoon, set up camp, and started a fire. As we were sitting around, talking and roasting marshmallows, a guy wandered into our campsite. He was around our age, maybe mid-20s, and said he'd been hiking for a while but lost track of the trail. His clothes were dirty and he looked exhausted, but he didn't seem dangerous or anything, just lost. We offered him some water and told him he could hang with us for a bit until he figured out where he was going. He sat down and started chatting, but something about the way he talked was off. He kept asking weird questions like, "Do you guys come here often? How long are you staying?" We told him we'd only be there for the night, and he just smiled and nodded, staring into the fire. After about an hour, he got up and said he should probably keep moving. We pointed him toward the main trail, and he walked off into the woods. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but something about that guy stuck with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just lost. He was watching us for a reason. The next morning, as we were packing up to leave, one of my friends noticed something strange. There were footprints all around our campsite, too many to just be ours. And they were fresh. The thing is, these prints weren't heading in the direction we sent that guy. They circled our tents and then led back into the woods, deeper than where we'd originally seen him go. We hiked out in silence, the feeling of being watched never really leaving us. Later, we found out from a local news article that a few people had gone missing in that area over the years, all reported to have been last seen hiking or camping alone. To this day, I wonder if we narrowly avoided being the next ones to disappear. About 3 years ago, I went on a camping trip with my girlfriend at the time. We chose a remote site in the woods, near a lake we'd heard was great for fishing. We arrived in the early afternoon and spent the day setting up our tent and exploring the area. While hiking along a small trail that ran by the lake, we stumbled across another campsite about half a mile from ours. What was strange, though, was that it looked completely abandoned. A tent was still set up, but the fabric was torn in places, and the campfire pit was cold. There were personal belongings scattered around: clothes, a backpack, even some food that had been left out and was starting to rot. It was like whoever had been there left in a hurry. We thought it was weird, but figured maybe the campers had a family emergency or something. As we made our way back to our own site, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I mentioned it to my girlfriend, but she brushed it off, telling me not to overthink it. That night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something moving through the brush near our tent. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but the footsteps were too heavy. It sounded like a person walking, slowly, almost deliberately, circling our tent. I grabbed a flashlight and unzipped the tent, but by the time I looked outside, the sound had stopped. There was nothing there. I woke up my girlfriend and we decided to stay up for the rest of the night, just in case. At first light, we packed up and left as quickly as we could. On the way out, we passed by that abandoned campsite again. But this time it wasn't the same. The torn tent was gone, and so were the scattered belongings. It was like no one had ever been there at all. We never went back to that spot, and I still wonder who, or what, had been camping there before us, and why they left so suddenly. 2 summers ago, I decided to go camping alone for a weekend. I'd been through a rough patch and wanted to get away, clear my head, and enjoy some peace and quiet. I found a secluded spot in a national forest a few hours away from my hometown, where I wouldn't be disturbed. The first night went smoothly. No strange noises, no wildlife encounters, just me and the stars. But on the second night, things got weird. Around midnight, as I was lying in my tent, I saw a faint light through the fabric. At first, I thought maybe it was the moon, but this light was moving, slowly and methodically, almost like someone was walking through the woods with a flashlight. I sat up and unzipped the tent, but as soon as I looked outside, the light disappeared. There was no one there. The forest was dead silent, which only made the whole thing creepier. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but about an hour later, the light returned, this time brighter and closer. It flickered in and out of the trees, almost like it was searching for something. My heart was pounding, and I debated whether to investigate or stay in the tent. I chose the latter. The light circled my campsite for what felt like hours, but when I finally worked up the nerve to look outside again, there was no sign of anyone. No footsteps, no rustling, just darkness. I left first thing the next morning. I don't know if it was just some random person lost in the woods or something else entirely, but I haven't gone camping alone since. A few years ago, a group of friends and I went camping in a small forest preserve not far from our town. It wasn't a popular spot, which is why we liked it. It gave us the freedom to be loud, drink, and have a good time without worrying about bothering anyone. On the second night, just after dark, We were sitting around the fire when we noticed a man standing at the edge of the clearing, maybe 30 feet from us. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, staring at us. He was dressed like a hiker, but he didn't have a backpack or any gear. At first, we thought he might be another camper, but when one of us called out to him, he didn't respond. He just kept standing there, motionless. After a minute or two, he turned and walked into the trees, disappearing from sight. We were all a little freaked out, but figured he was just some weirdo passing through. Later that night, as we were settling into our tents, I heard footsteps outside. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was trying to sneak around. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it through the mesh of the tent, but I didn't see anyone. I wasn't the only one who heard it either. My friend in the next tent whispered that she could hear it too. The footsteps continued for what felt like an hour, circling our tents. No one dared to step outside. When we finally built up the courage to check, there was no one there, but fresh footprints led away from the campfire and into the woods. We left the next morning without saying much to each other. Whoever that guy was, he was watching us, and I can't help but wonder what he would have done if we'd been less cautious. About 2 summers ago, my buddies and I went on a weekend camping trip deep into a national forest. We chose this particular spot because it was way off the beaten path. No cell service, no marked trails, just miles of dense woods. We had hiked in a good 5 miles before setting up camp next to a small, trickling creek. The first night was perfect. Clear skies, a warm fire, and a few beers as we laughed and told stories. But on the second night, things got strange. Around midnight, we started hearing rustling in the trees just beyond our campsite. At first, we thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon, but the sounds were deliberate. Footsteps, not scurrying. We shined our flashlights into the woods, but we couldn't see anything. The trees were too thick, and the light didn't penetrate far. We brushed it off and went back to talking, but the footsteps continued. It was like someone was slowly circling our campsite just out of view. We called out, thinking maybe it was another hiker or camper who had gotten lost, but there was no response. Just more footsteps, always staying in the shadows. After a while, the footsteps stopped, but none of us could relax. We kept our flashlights nearby and took turns keeping watch until dawn. The next morning, we decided to pack up early and head out. As we were loading our gear, one of my friends stopped dead in his tracks and pointed at the ground. There, just beyond the edge of our campsite, were clear footprints, human footprints, leading in a circle around our tents. They were fresh, and they definitely weren't ours. We had no idea how long whoever it was had been watching us, or why they never made their presence known. We hiked out as fast as we could, and I've never been back to that forest since. There's something unsettling about knowing someone was there, just out of reach, observing us, and we never knew why. I went camping alone once, about 4 years ago, in a state park that's known for its beautiful but remote trails. I was between jobs at the time and thought a solo camping trip would be a good way to clear my head. I hiked out to a quiet spot by a lake that wasn't listed on any official maps, but had been recommended by some locals. The first day was peaceful, and I spent it fishing and exploring the area. By the time evening rolled around, I had a small fire going and was enjoying the solitude. That night, I fell asleep easily, but I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound, a low humming noise like distant machinery. I sat up, confused. There were no roads or buildings for miles. I thought maybe it was a plane overhead, but the sound didn't move. It stayed steady, a faint buzz in the air. I checked my watch, 3:30 a.m. I opened my tent and looked outside. The fire had died down to embers, but everything seemed normal. I tried to go back to sleep, but the humming continued. It felt like it was getting closer, but I couldn't pinpoint the direction. I lay there for hours, on edge, until the sun finally came up. By then, the sound had stopped, and I was ready to pack up and leave. When I stepped outside my tent, though, something was off. Everything around me felt different. The trees didn't seem as familiar, and the lake, which had been just a few hundred feet away, was now completely out of sight. I thought maybe I had hiked farther than I realized the previous day, but that didn't make sense. I hadn't gone far at all. I quickly packed my gear and started walking back the way I came, but nothing looked the same. I felt disoriented, like I'd stepped into a different part of the forest overnight. I had no cell service and no map, so I just kept walking in what I thought was the right direction. Eventually, after hours of hiking, I stumbled upon the main trail and made my way back to the parking lot. To this day, I have no idea what happened that night. I haven't told many people because it sounds insane, but I know for sure that when I woke up, I wasn't in the same place I'd fallen asleep. A few friends and I decided to camp at a popular site near a mountain range a few hours outside of town. It wasn't too crowded, but there were a few other groups camping nearby. We set up our tents a short distance from a guy who was camping alone. He didn't seem too interested in socializing, which was fine by us. We were there to enjoy nature, not make friends. The first night was uneventful, but on the second night, we noticed something strange. As we were sitting around the fire, we realized that we hadn't seen the solo camper all day. His tent was still set up, and his campfire was out, but there was no sign of him. We assumed he'd gone for a long hike or something and didn't think much of it. But as the night wore on, it got weirder. Around midnight, we heard rustling from his campsite. It sounded like someone moving around, but when we looked over, there was no one there. The tent flap was open, and we could see inside, empty. The rustling continued for a while, and then we heard what sounded like heavy breathing coming from the trees just beyond his tent. None of us wanted to investigate, so we just sat there, uneasily watching his campsite. After about an hour, the sound stopped, and everything went silent. We didn't sleep much that night, and first thing in the morning, we packed up and left. On the way out, we passed by his campsite again. The tent was still there, but it had been flattened, like something heavy had collapsed it. We didn't see the guy, and we never found out what happened to him. Part of me wonders if he was even out there in the first place, or if someone or something else had been camping next to us that whole time. This happened last year. My girlfriend and I decided to go camping at a small family-owned campground that we'd heard about from some friends. It wasn't far from our town, but it was known for being peaceful and quiet, which is exactly what we were looking for. We arrived late in the afternoon and found a nice spot near the back of the campground, away from most of the other campers. We set up our tent and started a fire as the sun went down. Everything was going great until another camper showed up. A guy in his mid-30s pulled up in an old, beat-up truck and parked a few sites down from us. He didn't say anything as he got out and started setting up his tent, but there was something off about him. He kept glancing over at us while he worked, like he was checking to see if we were watching him. We tried to ignore him, but as the night went on, he started acting even stranger. He would wander around his campsite, muttering to himself, and occasionally walk toward the woods, disappearing for a few minutes before coming back. At one point, he stood at the edge of his site, staring at us for what felt like forever, before turning and walking into the trees again. By midnight, we'd had enough. We packed up our stuff and moved to a different part of the campground, closer to the other campers. The next morning, we left early. As we were driving out, we passed his site again, but his truck was gone, and his tent had been ripped apart. We later found out that the guy wasn't even supposed to be there. The campground owner told us they'd had issues with trespassers before, but no one had ever been caught. It still creeps me out to think about what that guy was doing out there, and why he was so interested in us. A couple of summers ago, my girlfriend and I decided to go camping in a national forest a few hours from home. We weren't hardcore hikers or anything, but we enjoyed the quiet, off-grid vibe. We chose a spot that was well off the main road. No cell service, no other campers in sight. The first day was perfect. We spent the morning hiking, took a swim in a nearby creek, and set up camp in the late afternoon. By the time evening rolled around, we had a fire going and were just relaxing. That's when we noticed a guy walking through the woods, maybe 100 yards from our camp. He wasn't on a trail, just cutting through the trees. He had a backpack, so we figured he was another camper. He didn't wave or make any gesture to acknowledge us, but we didn't think much of it at first. There were miles of wilderness around us, and it wasn't unusual for people to wander off the trails. As night fell, though, we both realized something strange. There were no other campsites nearby. We hadn't passed any other hikers all day, and this guy seemed to come out of nowhere. Around 9 p.m., we heard the sound of snapping branches. I shined my flashlight into the woods but didn't see anything. My girlfriend and I joked about it being a bear or some other wildlife, but deep down, we were both on edge. As we were about to call it a night, I heard footsteps again, this time closer, maybe 30 feet from our tent. I called out, "Hello, is someone there?" Silence. Then, faint rustling. I stepped out of the tent, flashlight in hand, and scanned the trees. Still nothing. But just as I was about to go back inside, I caught a glimpse of something. Movement, behind a thick cluster of trees. I could barely make it out, but there was definitely someone standing there, watching us. We didn't sleep much that night, and first thing in the morning we packed up. On our hike back, we passed the spot where we'd seen the guy the day before. What freaked me out was that there were no footprints, no sign anyone had been there. To this day, I don't know who that hiker was, or why he was out there. I've been back to the area a few times since, but I always stay closer to the main trails. I still get the chills thinking about how someone was out there so close, watching us, and we had no idea why. This happened last fall when I went camping with two of my best friends. We'd picked a remote spot in the woods near a river, far from any designated campgrounds. It was late in the season, so we weren't expecting to see anyone else out there. The first night was uneventful. We set up camp, cooked some food over the fire, and went to bed early. The next day, we spent most of it fishing and hiking, just enjoying the peace and quiet. But when we got back to our campsite around sunset, we noticed something was wrong. The fire pit had been disturbed. It wasn't much, just some rocks shifted around and the ashes spread out, but it was clear someone had been there. We shrugged it off, thinking maybe an animal had gotten into it or the wind had blown things around. That night, though, things took a turn. Around midnight, one of my friends woke me up, whispering that he'd heard something moving outside the tent. I listened for a minute, but didn't hear anything, so we went back to sleep. An hour later, I woke up to the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps just outside the tent. I froze, barely breathing, listening as the steps circled around us. My heart was pounding. I whispered to my friends, and we all stayed perfectly still. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. There was a long pause, and then we heard a strange scraping noise, like something being dragged through the dirt. I slowly unzipped the tent and peeked outside. In the dim light of the dying fire, I saw a figure standing near the trees. They were wearing some kind of mask, a white, featureless face, and holding a long stick or pole. I ducked back inside the tent and whispered what I saw to my friends. We grabbed the knives we had and huddled together, waiting for the figure to leave. After what felt like hours, the sounds finally stopped, and we didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night. At first light, we packed up and got out of there. None of us talked much on the hike back, but we all agreed on one thing: we weren't camping in that area ever again. Last summer, my brother and I decided to do an overnight camping trip at a secluded lake we'd heard about from some locals. The only way to get there was by hiking a few miles through thick forest, which sounded like the perfect adventure. We set up camp near the water, not far from an old, dilapidated cabin we found in the woods. It looked abandoned, broken windows, a collapsed roof, but we didn't think much of it. We figured it was just an old hunting cabin someone had left behind. As night fell, we built a fire and sat by the lake, enjoying the calm. Around 11 p.m., though, we started hearing noises coming from the direction of the cabin. It sounded like something, or someone, was moving around inside. My brother suggested we check it out, but I wasn't too keen on the idea. After all, the place was falling apart, and who knew what animals might have taken up residence in there. But the noises continued, soft, creaking, like footsteps on old wood. Eventually, curiosity got the better of us and we grabbed our flashlights to investigate. When we reached the cabin, the door was slightly ajar. My brother pushed it open and we stepped inside. The place was a wreck. Broken furniture, piles of debris, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. But what caught our attention were the footprints. They weren't ours, bare feet trailing through the dust, leading into a back room. We followed the prints to the room, which was mostly empty except for a large wooden chest. The footprints stopped right in front of it. My brother tried to open it, but the lid was locked. At that moment, we heard a loud crash from outside the cabin, like something big had fallen over. We bolted out of there, running back to our campsite. We didn't sleep much that night, and first thing in the morning, we packed up and left. We later found out that the cabin had a dark history. A family had lived there years ago, but they disappeared without a trace, and no one ever found out what happened to them. I don't know if those footprints were from some animal or if someone or something else was out there, but I'm never camping near that lake again. 2 summers ago, I went on a camping trip with my girlfriend. We chose a spot deep in a state forest that had very few visitors, which was perfect for some quiet time away from everything. The first night was pretty chill, just the usual stuff, making a fire, cooking, and stargazing. Around 11 p.m., we decided to head into the tent and call it a night. About an hour later, just as I was drifting off, I heard a faint rustling sound outside. At first, I thought it might have been a raccoon or something, but then the rustling turned into slow, deliberate footsteps circling our campsite. I whispered to my girlfriend, asking if she heard it too. She mumbled something, clearly half asleep, but I was wide awake now. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had almost died out, but I could make out the shapes of trees and the shadows they cast. There didn't seem to be anyone there. Then I saw it. A faint beam of light, almost like someone was shining a flashlight from behind the trees. It flickered briefly and then vanished. My heart was pounding, but I didn't want to freak my girlfriend out, so I zipped the tent back up and lay there listening. The footsteps had stopped, but every few minutes, I'd catch a glimpse of that light in the distance. I didn't sleep much that night. In the morning, I checked the area around our camp, but there were no footprints or any sign that someone had been walking around. We shrugged it off and figured maybe we had just imagined it. But that night, the footsteps came back. This time, they were closer, like someone was pacing just outside our tent. I opened the tent flap, flashlight in hand, but saw nothing. That's when I heard a low whistle, almost like someone calling a dog, but no words. Just a long, eerie note that echoed through the trees. We packed up and left the next morning, cutting our trip short. To this day, I have no idea who or what was out there, but I haven't gone camping in a remote spot like that since. A few years ago, I went on a solo camping trip to a spot I'd been to once before. It's a secluded area by a river, and there's a small wooden bridge you have to cross to get there. The place has always been peaceful, and I was looking forward to a quiet weekend. The first day was great. I set up my tent, fished for a while, and spent most of the day by the river. As night fell, I built a fire and relaxed by the water. Around 10 p.m., I heard something that sent chills down my spine, creaking. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. The sound of wood groaning, like someone was walking across that old bridge. I turned toward the sound, but the bridge was out of sight from where I was sitting. My first thought was that maybe an animal had wandered onto it. But then I heard it again, louder this time. Creak, creak. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the bridge. When I got close enough, I shined the light onto it, but there was no one there. The bridge was still, swaying slightly in the breeze. I stood there for a while, listening, but the creaking had stopped. I headed back to my camp, still feeling uneasy. Not long after I got back, the creaking started again. This time, it was faster, like someone was running across the bridge. I grabbed my knife and flashlight and ran back to the bridge, but again, nothing. I didn't sleep much that night. The creaking came and went, on and off, all night long. By morning, I was exhausted and ready to leave. As I crossed the bridge to head back, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A deep gouge in one of the wooden planks, like someone had hacked at it with a knife. I don't know what caused that creaking, but it felt like something, or someone, was trying to lure me out there. I haven't gone back to that campsite since. Last fall, a group of friends and I went camping at a popular state park. We had made a reservation for one of the more remote sites, but when we arrived, there was someone else camped there. They were a couple, quiet, keeping to themselves, and we didn't want to start a confrontation, so we decided to just set up at a nearby open site. Things started to feel off pretty quickly. First, we noticed that the campsite we had moved to wasn't officially listed on the park map, but it had a fire pit and a cleared area for tents. We figured maybe it was just an old campsite that wasn't used anymore, but there was no reason to worry about it. As night fell, We were sitting around the fire, telling stories and enjoying the night, when we heard the faint sound of a woman crying. It was distant at first, but gradually it grew louder, like she was moving closer. We all stopped talking and listened. The crying continued, mixed with soft, shuffling footsteps through the leaves. One of my friends called out, asking if someone needed help, but there was no answer, just more crying. The fire flickered in the wind, casting long shadows through the trees, and we all just sat there, waiting. Finally, the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. We didn't hear anything else that night, but in the morning we found something strange. A pile of rocks stacked neatly in front of our tent, almost like a marker. None of us had put it there, and it hadn't been there when we went to bed. We packed up and left that morning. Later, we asked the park ranger about the unmarked campsite, and he gave us a weird look. "There's no campsite over there," he said. "That area's been closed off for years." Last spring, I went camping with a couple of buddies in a national forest a few hours from the city. We had a great first day, hiking, swimming, and setting up camp in a clearing by a small stream. We were miles from any other campers, and it was exactly the kind of peaceful getaway we were hoping for. That night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the tent. At first, I thought it was one of my friends getting up to use the bathroom, but when I looked over, both of them were still asleep. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I nudged my friends awake, and we all listened. The steps circled around our tent once, then stopped. We stayed completely silent, barely breathing. After a long, tense minute, we heard the zipper on our tent start to open. My heart was pounding as I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the entrance. The zipper stopped halfway, and the footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. We unzipped the tent and looked outside, but there was no one there, just our campfire, still smoldering. We stayed up the rest of the night, keeping watch. The next morning, we packed up and left, cutting our trip short. When we got back to the trailhead, we ran into a couple of park rangers. We told them about the footsteps, and one of the rangers mentioned that there had been reports of a man wandering the forest, sneaking into campsites and watching people as they slept. They hadn't caught him yet. We were lucky he didn't come back, but I haven't been able to shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching us, just waiting for the right moment.